along the French coastline when something strange happens. Bubbles suddenly rise around him, and when he looks up, the clouds above are spinning in an eerie circular pattern. Paul doesn't realize that the bubbles in the water are forming the same shape around his body before vanishing without a trace. Later, back at home, Paul tries to cook but notices the kitchen tap has stopped working. He heads down to the basement to check the water heater, and his young daughter Mia follows him. He has to keep the door carefully closed so their cat, Tofu, doesn't slip inside. While Paul works on the heater, Mia sits nearby, playing beside a fish tank. She asks if they can buy more fish, since she only has one, but Paul says things are already chaotic enough with Tofu running around. When Mia walks over to hand him a tool, she suddenly panics at the sight of a spider. Paul calms her down, explaining that spiders are harmless and even helpful. To make her laugh, he scoops her up and jokingly pretends to be a monster before sending her back upstairs. That evening, Elise, Paul's wife, puts on some music and dances with Mia in the living room, telling her that there's no wrong way to dance. After Mia goes to bed, Elise and Paul share a quiet, intimate moment together. On May 5th, Paul suddenly wakes up feeling uneasy, as if something inside him has changed. Paul starts noticing that all his shirts hang awkwardly long on him. After a tiring day at work, he sits down for dinner with his family. Mia asks him to read her a bedtime story, but Paul refuses, saying he is exhausted and will do it tomorrow. Mia reminds him that he said the same thing the night before and storms off. Elise is upset with him, so Paul goes to Mia's room to make things right. They begin reading, but soon argue about how big a meteorite in the story really is, and Paul cuts the story short. As he leaves, Mia lies down on the floor, refusing to move until he plays with her. Paul lifts her by the legs and gently swings her until she laughs, then tucks her back into bed. By May 7th, Paul's clothes look even looser. Elise asks if he's losing weight, but Paul snaps that weight loss doesn't shorten your arms and legs. Elise grows worried and suggests something might be wrong. Paul visits a doctor, who measures him and tells him he's now 176 centimeters tall, even though he's been 180 for most of his life. The doctor shrugs it off as aging, but Paul knows something isn't right. At work, Paul realizes his helmet keeps slipping. When he checks the inside, it still has his name on it, meaning it is definitely his. That night, he lies awake thinking about the strange clouds he saw while swimming. He tries exercising to wear himself out, but Elise eventually convinces him to come back to bed. By May 20th, the changes are impossible to ignore. While showering, Paul sees that the shower head now sits too high. His wedding ring slips off his finger, and when he joins Elise in the kitchen, she realizes he is now shorter than her. Alarmed, Paul goes to the hospital, where doctors run every test they can, from blood work to full body scans. A few hours later, the doctor returns with Paul's test results. Everything looks normal, yet his body tells a different story. He is now only 165 centimeters tall and weighs 63 kilos, meaning he has lost 15 centimeters and 10 kilos in just a few weeks. The doctor admits she has never seen anything like this before and has no explanation, but she believes the shrinking is happening at a steady rate and will likely continue. Paul undergoes even more tests, but the strange images of blood vials and the swirling clouds from that day at sea begin to haunt his dreams. He realizes the doctors have no answers and walks out. Back at home, he becomes painfully aware of how small he has grown. His feet no longer reach the floor when he sits, and he feels increasingly distant from Elise and Mia. He starts ignoring calls from the hospital altogether. Elise suggests that they should move and temporarily send Mia to live with her grandparents until they can figure things out. Meanwhile, the cat, Tofu, keeps staring at him, making Paul uneasy. To keep him safe, Elise locks the pet door and sends the cat outside. By June 30th, Paul has shrunk to the size of a cell phone. Tofu watches him through the window, unmoved even by the rain. When Elise brings in potential buyers to show the house, Paul panics and dives under the bed, crushed as he listens to strangers talk about his home like it's just another property. After they leave, Paul explodes at Elise for not warning him and putting his life at risk. He's furious that she is selling the house without his consent. Elise reminds him that she did talk about it before and that they no longer have an income. But Paul keeps shouting, insisting it is still his home. Her words finally push him over the edge. Paul insists that treatment is meant for sick people, and he refuses to be turned into some kind of lab experiment. He claims he feels fine and doesn't want strangers poking at him. Elise finally snaps back. When she raises her voice, the force of it nearly knocks Paul off the counter. Horrified by what she's done, she apologizes and storms out of the house. As Paul looks down the hallway, he realizes Mia has witnessed everything. On July 5th, Mia places Paul inside her dollhouse. He plays along, admiring the tiny rooms and pretending it is a real home. He even asks her to put on some music so he can dance with one of the dolls, which finally makes her smile again. But when Mia starts playing monster like they used to, her movements and booming voice become terrifying at his size. Seeing his fear, she quickly apologizes. That night, Elise can't sleep. When Paul approaches the bed, she reaches out her hand, and he carefully steps onto it so he can lie beside her. By July 30th, Paul is no larger than a cork. As he works with a thread and a fishing hook, Tofu keeps pushing at the pet door from outside until it finally opens. The cat rushes in and startles Paul, causing him to fall onto the hook and injure himself. He manages to pull it out and removes his shirt to examine the wound, but Tofu is already crouched in hunting mode. Grabbing a needle for defense, Paul runs as the cat chases him. He darts through the dollhouse, but Tofu simply leaps over it. Paul reaches the basement door and slips underneath, but Tofu's paw swipes through the gap, knocking him down the stairs. He lands in a trash-filled box and blacks out. A short time later, Elise comes home and finds Paul's bloodstained shirt, assuming something terrible has happened. Meanwhile, Paul regains consciousness and calls out for her. Elise rushes downstairs, searching, but she can neither see nor hear him. Tofu returns, purring as he senses his prey, which makes Elise turn around. She assumes the cat has eaten her husband and chases him up the stairs, screaming his name. Paul, still trapped below, Paul realizes he can't wait anymore and must find a way to survive. He cuts a strip of fabric on a nail to wrap around himself for clothing, using a thin wire as a belt. Then he explores the trash box and finds a small hole in its side, finally giving him a way out. He begins moving toward the window, but freezes when he hears something shifting in the shadows. Panicked, Paul scrambles up onto the platform beneath the water heater. The window is useless because a mosquito net blocks it. With a pipe leaking nearby, he drinks the dripping water and cleans his body, especially his wound. Too frightened to move in the darkness, he eventually falls asleep under the water heater. The next morning, Paul wakes to the sound of Mia calling his name. He rushes toward the stairs, but they are far too tall to climb. He shouts back, but she can't hear him. Moments later, he hears the front door open and a car start, realizing his family has left. Now alone, Paul searches for anything that might help him survive. He finds a piece of chalk and writes his name on the floor. Then he squeezes between the furniture and the wall, discovering ants feeding on cheese from a mouse trap. He drives them away with his needle and drops a nail onto the trap. It snaps shut, leaving the cheese free for him to eat. A spider suddenly appears above him. Paul bangs the nail against the wall to create loud vibrations until the spider retreats. He then tries to break open another box with the nail, but it won't give way. Paul goes back to the trash box and grabs a strip of fabric along with a bottle cap, which he fills with water. He soaks the cloth and presses it against the cardboard to soften it. When he strikes it again with the nail, a hole finally opens. Crawling through, he discovers a box of matches, but heavy objects block his path, making them impossible to reach. He plugs the hole with an eraser and tries to get some rest. As he lies there, he hears movement upstairs and then the lights go out, making him wonder who is in the house now. On July 15th, Paul wakes to voices echoing above. He shouts and bangs his nail and paper clip together, desperate to be heard. The basement door opens briefly, but the people only glance inside before closing it again and leaving. Paul sinks to the floor, crushed by disappointment. Trying to drown his misery, he uses his needle to pry at the cork of a bottle until wine begins to drip out. He fills a thimble and drinks until he gets sick. The spider watches him from atop the fish tank, and in his drunken state, Paul brags to one of Mia's dolls that he will deal with it. He climbs up onto the tank, and the spider retreats for a moment. Laughing at what he thinks is a victory, Paul loses focus, giving the spider the chance to shove him into the water. Only to see the spider still waiting. He dives again and swims alongside the fish until the spider moves away. Later, he tosses some fish food into the tank and tastes it himself, only to realize how awful it is. That night, as Paul returns from refilling his bottle cap at the water heater, the spider is waiting beneath the fish tank. It creeps toward him, and Paul raises his needle like a sword. He strikes its legs a few times, but the spider keeps coming. Paul dashes behind a furniture leg, and the spider follows, until he jabs it again and finally forces it to retreat. But the spider scrambles up the wooden leg and tries to strike from above. Paul jabs it once and bolts. The chase continues beneath the furniture until Paul stumbles over some loose wires. The spider leaps onto him, and Paul fights back desperately. Spotting a splinter, he grabs it and drives it toward the creature's eyes until it recoils. Paul shouts, and the spider finally retreats into the shadows. Afterward, Paul manages to punch another hole through the box and finally reaches the matches. With his tiny strength, it takes several tries, but he eventually sparks a flame. He builds a small fire to keep warm, eats cheese, and talks to Mia's doll, telling it how much he misses his family and asking it to pass on a message if it ever sees Mia again. Days go by as Paul keeps himself alive by exercising, eating, and sleeping inside the box. On July 20th, he hears footsteps and rushes toward the stairs. A man is coming down. Paul waves and tries to shout, but he is so small that the man's normal voice and heavy steps feel overwhelming. He covers his ears, runs under the stairs, and collapses with a pounding headache, crying until the man finally leaves. When Paul comes back out, he realizes the fish is gone. Now he is truly alone. On August 2nd, a mosquito slips through the window and hovers in front of him. Paul stares at it, realizing he is nearly as tiny as the insect. When it flies away, he wonders if he might now fit through the mosquito net. He begins climbing the furniture, a slow and exhausting journey. At last, he reaches the top, leaps across, and lands on the bricks. From there, he can walk along the wall toward the window. But when he reaches a web, he discovers the spider is still there, waiting. He inches forward, trying not to disturb the web, but his elbow barely grazes it and that is enough. The spider senses the vibration and rushes toward him. Paul bows his head, certain it is the end. He starts to cry, so terrified that he even wets himself. The spider pauses, confused, just as a fly gets trapped in the web. Drawn by the new prey, it abandons Paul and scurries back to feed. Paul continues on, and after a long struggle, he finally reaches the window. But when he tries to squeeze through the mesh, he realizes he is still too large to slip out. On August 7th, Paul wakes up to an ant biting his leg. He kicks it away, and the ant is immediately snatched by the spider. Another ant slips through the net, and Paul realizes he has finally shrunk enough to follow it. He moves fast, narrowly avoiding the spider as they lock eyes for a brief moment. For a second, Paul wonders if the creature feels just as lonely as he does. Soon, Paul is out in the open. Blades of grass tower over him like trees, and droplets of water look like giant glass beads. A butterfly drifts past, its wings sending a gentle breeze across his face. They look at each other before it flies away. Paul lifts his gaze to the night sky and thinks of Mia, knowing she is probably staring at the same stars somewhere far away.